A very warm welcome to all of you. Today we're very fortunate to have with us Dr. Soundarya Iyer, who's going to be talking to us on circular migration and localized urbanization. So Dr. Soundarya Iyer is an associate professor at RB University, Bangalore, and she's also associated with the French Institute of Pondicherry in India. And Soundarya is interested in interdisciplinary approaches to the study of agrarian change, climate change, gender, and livelihoods in India. She's worked on several very interesting national and international projects on a wide range of issues such as climate change, adaptation, women's workforce participation, and agrarian change. Welcome, Soundarya, and we're really looking forward to your talk today on circular migration and localized urbanization. Over to you.
My talk is titled Circular Migration and Localized Urbanization in Rural India. Many thanks to Dr. Amrita Datta for inviting me to this guest lecture. This talk is based on a paper that I published in 2017 with the same title, Circular Migration and Localized Urbanization in Rural India. This was part of my PhD thesis, where I investigated rural and agrarian change in 3 villages in the state of Karnataka. One of these villages, called Mahagaon in the paper, I saw something phenomenal taking place. There was an urban hamlet located at the crossroads of 2 highways, a national highway and a state highway. And it turned out that my research began to try to figure out how this hamlet had emerged, because I was investigating the change in the village since 1961 using the village survey monographs produced by the Census of India 1961. And the hamlet on the highway did not exist in 1961, and it was present at the time of my study. Right, so just a brief outline of this lecture today. I'll make a case for studying the source of circular migration, which is what I insist in this particular piece of research. I'll talk a little bit about the village and the kind of people, the kind of agriculture that exists in the village, the environmental constraints in the village, the aspect of circular migration. What do migrants bring back when they circulate? How does it impact transport and infrastructure within the village itself, as well as the investment in business? So some empirical details about the growth of transport, infrastructure, and business in the village itself. And finally, the conceptualization that I come up with, which is localized urbanization. Right? So to begin with, we all know that internal migration, the literature talks about how internal migration drives urbanization in the Indian context as well as across the world. Usually, you find theories of labor migration focusing on migration from the rural to the urban, and from national to international settings. And migration is typically seen as a one-time, one-way movement, and permanent settlement is seen as the destination is seen as the goal of all migration. So if migrants circulate, it's typically seen as a failure of migration, right? So when in India and in other countries you find a very high percentage of circular migrants, we say that the urbanization is not actually taking place. There's slow urbanization taking place in the country. So once migrants settle at the destination, which is the city, urbanization occurs, and any kind of circulation is seen as a failure of migration. Now, most studies on circular migration address this two-way nature of migration. So you find the focus of these studies differing, right? So there's a broad literature on coping and accumulative migration, so which looks really at the migrant in the process of migration. So is the migrant migrating because of constraints and in that sense coping, or is the migrant actually able to migrate and accumulate at the destination through the process of migration? So these are definitions that have emerged in the literature which talk about the migrant itself. There's another set of literature which looks at the migrant at the destination of migration, right? So there's a large number of people who talk about the migrant at the destination of migration. So we look solely at the migrants as they navigate between their homes and the destination. What are their conditions of work at the destination? Do they have access to basic amenities at the destination? And so on and so forth. And this, of course, has many policy, it's really important for policy to understand the migrant at the destination of migration, because then services can be provided, schemes can be rolled out which help migrants in cities, right? The third kind of literature that I have observed is the study of migrants at the source of the migration. So what does migration really do to production relations, for instance? How does it improve the situation of migrants back in the village? So, for instance, does migration mitigate unequal relationships? Are migrants able to escape bondage? Say, if they're experiencing that in the village, are they able to get greater respect once they return back from the cities and come back to the village with some assets that they have accumulated, or if they're able to reinvest back in the village? So those kinds of relations between migrants and residents, and often residents may be, say for instance, the landowning classes of the village. So that's the third kind of literature that I've observed in this area. Now, what's quite interesting is that how migration changes in the village itself, particularly spatial change in the village, is a relatively unexplored area. Over the years, of course, since the publication of this paper, there has been much more focus on this particular aspect of circular migration and its impact on spatial changes in the sources of migration. But at the time that I was doing this research, there was very little literature available in this area. This particular aspect is quite important because if you look at the Indian scenario, where a lot of urbanization is taking place away from cities, right? And of course, we have million plus metropolitan cities, but these are only a few cities in the country. There's a large number of towns that are emerging across the country, and understanding the spatial nature of how migration impacts these towns and villages is the focus of this particular piece of research. Now let's look at Mahagaon village. This is a village in the northern district of Kalaburgi in Karnataka. It's a dryland village, and it's quite a large village with a population of 8,731 people in 2011. This region is known historically for its backwardness. It's had low literacy rates, very poor sex ratios, poverty is very high, hunger is a very major issue, and very low productivity in agriculture itself, right? And I'll come to this with my data itself. Way back in the late 1800s, there were famines in this particular district, which had very deep and long-lasting consequences for the peasantry. It increased landlessness, so you find Mahagaon as well as neighboring villages having very high percentages of landless people, and it also increased the phenomenon of dominant class tendency or reverse tendency, as you find that there were money lenders who were unable to cultivate the dry land. So there were poor people who had some plots of land who were indebted, and they basically lost their land to money lenders as they had taken loans from them at very high interest rates. And the money lenders were not really agriculturists from the agricultural class, and therefore they leased these lands out, causing the phenomenon of dominant class tendency to rise, right? So this phenomenon of landlessness, which arose way back in the 1800s, persists even today. You find that about 47% of households in Mahagaon are landless in 2014, and the figure remains the same from the 1961 village survey monograph from the Census of India as well, right? But if you look at also the average land holdings, right, these over the course of time, land holdings have been declining because of subdivision across families, from parents to children, from fathers to sons. You find that the ownership was on average 12.5 acres in 1961, and at the time of my survey in 2014, this ownership declined to about 3 acres per household, right? So what I did in my study was to carry out a sample survey. It was not a census like the 1961 village survey monograph. It was a sample of 1 in every 4 households in the village. So I surveyed 411 households in the village and carried out extensive interviews with a host of people, a whole range of people in the village as well. Now on the environmental constraints. So this particular district, the Kalaburgi district, is widely known as the Tuar district or the Arhar district of Karnataka. But if you look at the productivity, the yield of Tuar in this district, and this is data from 1998 to 2009, secondary data that's available, and you find that the productivity of Tuar has remained much lower than that of the all India productivity. So it is producing very large quantities of Tuar for the state, but in terms of overall productivity, there's a kind of a cap on how much the yield can increase, right? Because of the place being dependent entirely on rainfall. As a result of what I've discussed, which is a very high number of landless households in the village and sort of a stagnant agriculture, we find a lot of people engaged in circular migration in the village. So if you look at different castes who are actually predominantly landless, these are Dalits, the Lambanis, who are classified as either scheduled castes or scheduled tribes, differing to the state that you are referring to, and Muslim households. So these 3 groups are predominantly landless, and you find that they have 2 options in the village, right? Which is what they do, and then those who can, they migrate. So the two options are to be what is known as Kuli Aal, which is locally an attached laborer who gets an advance payment of something like rupees 70,000 per year, and this is made in 2 installments. This is a yearly contract with the landowner, and the person is an attached laborer for the landowner and performs all agricultural wage labor throughout the year. The other is just agricultural wage labor during the particular season. It could be the harvest season or any other time of the year, or the landless worker may perform other wage labor, and this could be something in the village or in the town, but often workers migrate circularly, primarily for construction work, to the metropolitan cities of Bombay and Bangalore primarily, as well as Pune. Right? So if you ask these workers how much time they're spending outside of the village working, we found that nearly 9% of the workers in Mahagaon spent anywhere from 1 to 10 months in a city in 2013, the year preceding the survey, right? And what were the strategies of circular migrants? They would typically leave their families back home, right? And this is what has also been known as translocal householding in the literature. Children were getting educated in schools, government schools in the village. They were staying with grandparents. Migrants would move to the city. They would often use their entitlements from the public distribution system that they were availing within the village in the city, right? So they would come back every month or so to collect their jawar from the public distribution system to the city for food. This would help them minimize expenditure in the city because the cost of living was extremely high. And they also accepted a low standard of life in the city, right? And I'll come to some of these indicators. In my later research in Bangalore, I have more recent research in Bangalore, I found that migrants, and particularly recent migrants, those who have come to the city of Bangalore in the last 6-7 years, actually spend quite a lot of money in basic amenities like access to drinking water. They are buying water from tankers in Bangalore, which is far more expensive than, say, what I would be spending on drinking water, right? So typically a circular migrant has a very low standard of life in the city. There are very high rates of open defecation among circular migrants because they don't have access to toilets, and even if they have access to toilets, they may not have access to water, or water may be too expensive, and so on and so forth, right? So there are, if you look at any aspect of household amenities, these are actually quite poor for circular migrants in the city. So even in Mahagaon, I found that circular migrants use these strategies in the process of migration. Now, the interesting thing was what migrants brought back, right? And this is what really got me interested in understanding the phenomenon of circular migration and its impact on the source itself, right? So migrants are circulating, they're not only in the city, they're also coming back. They brought back savings, of course, some amount of money that they were earning because the classic, Lewis model talks about how the wage differential actually moves people from rural to urban areas. So in urban areas, migrants were earning much higher wages in construction than they would even in the village or in Gulbarga town. So they were actually able to save. They were bringing back these savings to the village. They were also bringing back skills in construction, right? So I often heard from migrants that who had returned to the village and happened to be there, that someone had built the police station, someone else had built the panchayat building, the new panchayat building in Mahagaon, right? And they were able to do this because they had expertise now in various aspects of construction work. Thirdly, migrants also brought back these artifacts, right? So what you can see here is a photograph of Baba Saheb Ambedkar, along with photos of other family members who were deceased, in the house of a Dalit migrant. Now, this is a one-room house that had been constructed by the Dalit migrant himself. This photo of Baba Saheb Ambedkar had been bought in Bombay from the procession at Chaitya Bhumi in Dadar, which is usually the gathering that takes place on the occasion of Baba Saheb's death anniversary. And so you see that migrants also brought back cultural icons. They were also asserting their Dalit identity through these icons back in the village, right? And there were some changes that had taken place in the village as well. The entry into the Lingayat temple, Akka Mahadevi temple, had actually become, it was now accessible to all castes. In 1961, the marriage hall of the Akka Mahadevi temple was accessible only to Lingayat castes, whereas in 2014, Dalits had entry into the temple but also had access to the marriage hall for weddings, right? So you see that there is some change that's taking place due to the fact that Dalits are able to assert themselves. Now you also see a change in transport and road infrastructure that's taking place in this particular, in the entire district, in fact. So if you look at the road length, again this is from secondary data, what we found is that Mahagaon Humnabad was declared a national highway in 2006, and if you look at the road length, you can see that the road length in the district of Gulbarga has exceeded that of the state as a whole from 2000 onwards, right? So it is actually quite interesting that the road construction has taken place at a faster pace in this district. This means that there's better connectivity. Many of the landless households now can simply get on a bus and commute or migrate to the nearest town or city, right? You also find that it was quite fascinating to note that because of the stagnant agriculture, landowners too were diversifying what they were actually doing with capital. They began to invest in transport. So private modes of transport were increased in number, and this is also noted in the Census of India 2011. You had all modes of transport available in the village, including autos, cruisers, and cruisers were these shared vehicles in which a driver and a conductor were stationed, and they could actually, I think they could hold about 12 to 14 people. And I myself, when I was carrying out fieldwork, I found myself using these shared modes of transport and autos much more frequently than the government buses, because buses were not as frequent along the highway. So they really increased the connectivity between hamlets of the village itself, as well as across villages in the region. Now, if you look at another fascinating area, which is what were people actually borrowing loans for, right? And I tried to compare the data available from the 1961 Village Survey monograph to my own survey carried out in 2014, and there were some fascinating changes that have been taking place over this long period of time. Right, one was that if you look at the loans that were being taken to clear outstanding debts, which was about 1/4 of the loans in 1961 were to clear outstanding debts, and often these were loans taken from moneylenders at very high interest rates. The heartening thing was that this percentage had reduced, so the importance of moneylenders was a little bit was on the decline. Of all the loans that people were taking, only about less than 2% were to clear outstanding debts. We also find this finding, helpful. Now, if you look at what is the percentage of loans that are used for cultivation or for purchase of livestock, again here you see that there's been a very little change in loans that are being accessed for agriculture, which again goes with the fact that it's a place with dryland agriculture stagnating, and there's not much productivity, right? So you only find from about 12% to 15% of the loans in this entire long period of time being accessed for agriculture. In 1961, about 26% of loans were accessed for marriage. There was a slight decrease, but of course marriage remains one of the most important spaces for which indebtedness was seen. But what was really interesting were two other important things. One being loans being accessed for business, and here you see a massive change. Nearly 30% of loans in 2014 were being accessed to set up some or the other business within Mahagaon. And if you look at house repairs and construction, again, infrastructure was something that people were investing in. So about 9.7% of the debt in 2014 was for construction and house repairs, right? Within construction of household, this is household debt, so it's actually to improve their own house, their own houses. So these fascinating changes in Mahagaon also show you the kind of the shift away from agriculture to services that are taking place within the village, both business and construction. All of this resulted in this phenomenon that you see in this photograph along the highway. This is at the intersection of a national and a state highway. There is a new hamlet called the Mahagaon Cross. The 1961 Village Survey monograph does not have a mention of this hamlet, so this hamlet did not exist in 1961, but by 2014, there was an entire set of about 100 plus households along this highway. Many of the infrastructural buildings had moved towards the highway. So, for instance, the Panchayat building, police station, and so on, along with other houses, had moved towards the highway. And you find what the Census of India 2011 calls the hamlet Mahagaon Cross. Now, Cross is a common name for a settlement at the intersection of two roads in Karnataka. Many villages have hamlets called crosses. So this phenomenon I found to be very fascinating, and I coined the term localized urbanization to describe this process. This is a phenomenon of spontaneous growth of a new hamlet with an urban character in a rural context, right? And I'll come to why it has an urban character in a little bit. This is prompted by developments in the metropolis. So it's not entirely autonomously taking place in the village. It is connected to migration of landless workers to the city and their return back to the village. So it's prompted by developments in the metropolis, but it occurs locally. And it's taking place very far away from the metropolis at a considerable distance. Right? So this is the phenomenon of localized urbanization. So here is a map representing the hamlets of the Mahagaon Revenue Village, and you see that the actual village is here, which is interior, and it has some other smaller hamlets, Mahagaon Wadi, the Lambani Tanda, which is occupied only by Lambanis, and the Chandarnagar Vaddar colony, only occupied by the Vaddar castes. Mahagaon itself is a multi-caste hamlet, and Mahagaon Wadi too is a multi-caste hamlet. And more recently have emerged two other hamlets along this intersection of the national highway and the state highway. Right, one of which is a resettlement colony. So there was a dam constructed somewhere near another village, and villagers were resettled along the highway here. That's Dhamur. And then is Mahagaon Cross, which is exactly at the intersection of these two highways. Right? And the first households in Mahagaon Cross were set up in the 1970s. These were sterilization plots that were handed over to women who agreed to be sterilized, and predominantly Dalits and Muslims Dalit women and Muslim women agreed to be sterilized, and so you see a large number of Dalit and Muslim households in one part of Mahagaon Cross. So those were the oldest households there. But if you look at the hamlet today, 1/4 of the households of this entire revenue village are today on the cross, which you can see also from the size of this hamlet. It's quite a large hamlet. And now let's look at the character of this hamlet, right? As opposed to the old village itself, if you look at the cross, right? People don't have as many, so this is just an indicator of assets that I have constructed, but what it tells you is that people don't actually own much land, right? So they have much lesser asset ownership. People who live on Mahagaon Cross have much lesser asset ownership than those in the interior hamlets. But if you look at the nature of the housing that they're living in, the cement roof houses are very high in Mahagaon Cross as well as in the resettlement colony, right? As opposed to the other parts of the villages, the other hamlets of this village, which have very traditional houses. Sometimes stone is the material that's used. If you look at the use of LPG for cooking, again, very high in Mahagaon Cross. It indicates an urban character. The households with pit latrines, and of course, many of these pit latrines were not in use because water was scarce. But the fact that these people had built new houses with pit latrines, and the place looked much more urban than the interior hamlets of the village is quite evident. The other interesting phenomenon was that Mahagaon Cross had a vibrant rental housing market, right, which I did not observe in any of the villages that I have been to in Karnataka. You don't typically have a rental housing market. Here there were school teachers, there were people who were working for the government in different taluks, or people who were working for a railway line that was being constructed, and so on and so forth, actually renting houses along the highway. And it was easily accessible, and that's why there was a rental market that was available. So that's pretty much the empirical context of Mahagaon and the cross itself. Now, where does I try to frame what localized urbanization is in the last few minutes that I have, versus the phenomenon of subaltern urbanization, which is another phenomenon that we have seen in the literature more recently, which is the growth of settlements, urban settlements outside of the metropolitan cities. Subaltern urbanization has been defined as autonomous, economically vital, and independent of the metropolis. It's taking place far away and it doesn't have much connection with the city. So while you could see localized urbanization as a subset, because it's actually taking place, in a peripheral settlement, you could see it as a subset of subaltern urbanization. In fact, in the typology suggested by subaltern urbanization scholars, Mahagaon would be a non-peripheral settlement whose administrative status is contested. But if you look at the character of Mahagaon, it's actually not autonomous to the city, right? It's the growth of Mahagaon Cross is dependent on the metropolis. Autonomous urbanization would be where the demographic capacity exists for urbanization to be self-sustaining, independent of rural to urban migration, and very rapid. But here it is not independent of rural to urban migration, and so it doesn't neatly fit into this categorization of subaltern urbanization. And so if you see that, if you see this literature on subaltern urbanization too, you see that they have discussed migration, but usually they look at circular migration and return migration and their role in spatial restructuring of small towns. But usually they look at this growth of towns at the destination of migrants. So they're not looking at the source villages from which migrants emerge from. So there hasn't been much of a focus of looking at the source. Right? Now, why is this entire phenomenon important? This phenomenon is important because, as you've already learned through probably other lectures in this course, India's urbanization is considered to be slow, and we expect, while the rest of the world is almost 50% urbanized, we expect only in 2050 that India will just about have half of its population in cities by 2050, right? Only 50% will be 50% urbanized only by 2050. And the fascinating thing about India is that the urban growth is taking place away from metropolitan centers, because the pressure in metropolitan centers, the cost of living is so high, and the pressure is so high that you don't actually see that much permanent settlement taking place in cities. In fact, if we see in from the 2011 census, 30% of the urban growth came from what we call census towns. Even in Mahagaon, the fascinating thing was that Mahagaon was trying to argue for a taluk status. There were some protest movements in the village itself because of its very large population of 8,000, more than 9,000 people. It was trying to argue for being a taluk, and even historically in the 1961 monograph, Mahagaon used to have a taluk status. So using those claims, this particular village was claiming taluk status. It didn't actually get it in the end, but these claims were being made. So you see that this kind of growth of towns has been taking place in a very dispersed way in the Indian context, and therefore understanding what's happening to the sources of circular migration is extremely important. And I hope that with this lecture, I have shed some light on how source regions are extremely important, right? And spatial changes in these source regions are important to consider. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Soundarya. Absolutely fascinating talk. In fact, I can't help but ask one question about Mahagaon. So the Mahagaon cross, where you have more than 100 households, and you mentioned some of them were like, teachers, government servants, and so on. But can you tell us the composition of these households? Do they predominantly belong to the original village of Mahagaon, or are they mainly outsiders? A little bit more about the composition of the household.
That's a great question. Actually, there were many outsiders in the Mahagaon cross, right? There were also many villagers. The interesting thing was, I would find many, like I would go to the panchayat officials' houses which were located in the original village, but I would not find them there, right? So they would, although they had houses there, they would often be at the cross and where all the activity was taking. So even political discussions and activities were taking place at the cross. So it began to become a much more important space in many ways, not just in terms of the housing and the construction, but also politically it became a very important space. But I think in what you're asking, the initial housing, as I said, came up with the Dalits and Muslims who agreed to, get sterilized, and therefore those sterilization plots exist. So we have much fewer dominant caste households in the Mahagaon cross. So yeah, that would be my answer. Thank you.
Thanks. No, I think absolutely fascinating work, and I can't help but comment that, the method of village studies is so important, because you went to study something and you found this through the method of village studies, right? Otherwise, if someone goes to study migration, then this is something they wouldn't see, they wouldn't come across, and so on. So I think that's also something, in the course we have a segment on agriculture and agrarian change and migration, and for that, we can do as many household surveys as we want and case studies as we want, but I think this village studies are just so critical in understanding social change and transformation. So thanks so much, for taking us through what you have conceptualized yourself, localized urbanization, and especially in the context of, as you mentioned, urbanization being away from the metropolis, right? What we are seeing empirically in India so much. So I think this will also resonate with the students as they see, modernization theories don't work empirically. We have our own models. So really, we're very grateful to you that you took time and came and gave us this talk on your work. So thanks a lot, Soundarya. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Amrita.
Yeah. So I think with that we come to the close of this lecture on localized urbanization, and in the next class we will meet. Thanks a lot. So that was Dr. Soundarya Iyer, who shared her work on localized urbanization. As you can see, the method of village study was used to do a study, and then that itself helped her conceptualize the idea of localized urbanization and circular migration. So this is again a very important empirical work, also much for, for students who are looking at research methods, for students who are looking at village studies, agrarian change. There are also the Census of India village studies, which have been done historically, and Soundarya had the 1961 census data, which she used, village study data, which she used to later compare how things have changed. So just to kind of, sum it up, the other thing that this study does is that it's a longitudinal study. So it looks at a particular village over time. And to study changes, to understand changes, longitudinal data is really important. Longitudinal data is also very hard to collect, because if you're a researcher, that means that you either collect something today and then something 10 years later, and you go back to the same household or the same individuals or the same villages. And so longitudinal research is very important to understand social and economic change. It's also very hard to do. And so I hope you found this guest lecture useful. Thank you very much.